You are probably descended from the indigenous peoples who lived in Zacatecas, Guanajuato, Aguascalientes, Jalisco, or San Luis Potosí prior to the arrival of the Spanish from the south. This region has been dubbed the Center-West region of Mexico by historian Eric Van Young of the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Van Young estimates that this cultural area makes up around 10% of Mexico's current territory. In the 16th century, the Spanish province of Nueva Galicia, which covered an area of about 180,000 kilometers from the Pacific Ocean to the foothills of the Sierra Madre Occidental, included significant portions of the modern states of Jalisco, Nayarit, Zacatecas, and Aguascalientes. Before 1522, the year of contact with Spanish explorers, a wide variety of indigenous groups inhabited this vast territory. The Spanish colonial province that became known as Nueva Galicia was home to 72 different languages, according to Domingo Lázaro de Arregui's 1621 publication, Descripción de la Nueva Galicia. Cartografía Histórica de la Nueva Galicia, Universidad de Guadalajara, Escuela de Estudios Hispano-Americanos de Sevilla, España, Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico, 1984. The map shows that Nueva Galicia occupied a large portion of the same land that was inhabited by the indigenous people known as Chichimecas by the Spaniards and their Nahuatl allies. Regretfully, not all of the Amerindians who inhabited this region have been thoroughly researched. The extensive and deep-running mestizaje of the area has meant that at any time much beyond the close of the colonial period, the history of the native peoples has been progressively interwoven with or submerged in that of non-native groups. Dr. Van Young has explained in his analysis of this. Shortly after Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, fell in 1522, Hernán Cortés sent Cristobal de Olid on a mission to explore what is now Jalisco. The Christianized sedentary Indians from the south were the new allies that the Spaniards had to rely on in these early days. They were typically Mexica from Tenochtitlan, Tarascan from Michoacán, Otomi Indians from Querétaro, Cholulans or Tlaxcalans, who served as scouts and soldiers. The Nahuatl language, also referred to as the Aztec Empire's language, was spoken by most of these allies. In the service of Spain, these auxiliary troops were allowed to carry sidearms and ride horses, unlike other Indians. The Indians of Chichimeca. Large numbers of nomadic Chichimeca Indians began to appear as the Spanish and their Amerindian allies from the south moved north into what is now Jalisco, Aguascalientes, Guanajuato, and Zacatecas in the 1520s. The definitive source of information about the Chichimeca Indians is Professor Philip Wayne Powell's Soldiers, Indians, and Silver, North America's First Frontier War. Powell described the Chichimeca as an all-inclusive epithet with a spiteful connotation. The Mexica had literally described the Chichimecas as of dog lineage, using the Nahuatl words for dog, chichi, and rope, macatl. However, some historians have clarified that over time, the term Chichimeca has been interpreted in different ways. Although the term Chichimeca was used to refer to all of the nomadic hunters and gatherers who lived in this region of Mexico, the Chichimecs were actually a number of indigenous groups who shared a common language and lived throughout the vast area known to the Spanish as La Gran Chichimeca. The Zacatecos, Guachichiles, Tecuexes, Caxcanes, Otomi, Pames, and Guamares were the main tribes that inhabited this area. Only two of these groups, the Otomi and Pames, remain culturally distinct and have a living language. A primitive hunting-gathering culture centered on the collection of tunas, the fruit of the nopal tree, and mesquite was shared by all Chichimeca Indians. But a lot of them also subsisted on seeds, roots, and acorns. Frogs, lizards, snakes, and worms were among the many small animals that the Chichimecas hunted. The Chichimeca people were roughly distributed throughout a 7-state area in central Mexico, as depicted in the map. Few historical studies of the Chichimeca Indians, now mostly extinct cultures and languages, have been conducted because the majority of them were quickly absorbed into the Hispanic culture of 17th century Mexico. Ironically, the current residents of Guanajuato, Jalisco, Zacatecas, and Aguascalientes are largely descended from these indigenous peoples. They are therefore the ancestors of a large number of Mexican Americans. The best account of the Chichimeca Indian groups has come from the historian Paul Kirchhoff in his book, The Hunting-Gathering People of North Mexico. a primitive hunting-gathering culture centered on the collection of tunas, the fruit of the nopal tree, mesquite, and agave, was shared by the majority of Chichimeca Indians. But a lot of them also subsisted on seeds, roots, and acorns. The discovery of silver, 1546, a significant event that would alter the dynamics of the Zacatecas frontier and the Chichimeca peoples, occurred in 1546. A Basque aristocrat named Juan de Tolosa was shown some local mineral outcroppings on September 8th while he was meeting with a small group of Indians close to the location of the modern-day city of Zacatecas. The discovery that the mineral samples from this location contained silver ore led to the rapid establishment of a small mining community at 8,148 feet above sea level at Zacatecas. The prospect of rapid wealth suddenly drew a large number of prospectors, business people, and laborers to Zacatecas. Southern Mexican Indians flocked to the area in search of the higher wages that miners offered. Farther north, in San Martin, 1556, Chalchihuites, 1556, Avino, 1558, Sombrerete, 1558, Fresnillo, 1566, Mazapil, 1568, and Neves, 1574, rich mineral-bearing deposits would also be found over the course of the following 20 years. However, these hostile and intractable natives, determined to keep the strangers out, quickly reacted to the rather sudden intrusion of the Spaniards, according to Alan R. Franz, author of Huichol Ethnohistory, The View from Zacatecas. The Indians of Zacateco. The Mexica word zacate, grass, may have been the source of the name of the Zacatecos Indians, who occupied an area of 60,000 square kilometers in what is now the states of Zacatecas, eastern Durango, and Aguascalientes. However, according to some modern sources, the name actually came from the Zacatecos language and meant cabeza negra, or black head. Their propensity to paint their faces and bodies with different pigments, in this case black pigment, would be referenced by this. Nearest to the silver mines that the Spaniards would find in 1546 were the Zacatecos Indians. They lived in vast swaths of Zacatecas northwest and southwest. On the east and west, respectively, their territories shared borders with the Guachichiles and Tepehuanes. In modern-day Coahuila, they roamed as far north as Parras. The following map displays the Zacatecos and the neighboring Chichimeca tribes' territory. The Zacatecos Indians were of Uto-Aztecan ancestry, since they were members of the Aztecoidan language family. The Caxcanes Indians of southern Zacatecas and northern Jalisco were thought to be closely related to the Zacatecos. It was said that the Zacatecos were a tall, well-proportioned, muscular people. Long black eyes wide apart, large mouth, thick lips, and small flat noses were characteristics of their oval faces. The women wore short petticoats made of woven maguey or skins, while the men wore breechcloth. Hair was worn long, typically to the waist, by both sexes. The Zacatecos Indians painted reptilian shapes on their bodies and covered them with clay in a variety of hues. In addition to protecting them from the sun's rays, this paint also prevented rodents from getting on their skin. Roots, herbs, maize, beans, and some wild fruits were grown by some Zacatecos Indians. They mostly hunted birds, frogs, snakes, worms, moles, rats, rabbits, deer, and reptiles. The Zacatecos and a few other Chichimecas would eventually grow to enjoy the meat of the larger animals that the Spaniards brought with them. They regularly stole mules, horses, cattle, and other livestock during their raids on Spanish settlements, and they all incorporated these items into their diet. The Zacatecos were brave and bellicose warriors and excellent marksmen, according to Professor Powell. The nearby tribes were terrified of them, especially the Caxcanes, whom they later attacked after they started collaborating with the Spaniards. Before they both came to view the Spaniards as a common enemy in the 1550s, the Zacatecos were also said to be great enemies and always at war with their eastern neighbors, the Guachichiles. The Guachiles, from Lake Chapala in Jalisco to present-day Saltillo in Coahuila, the Guachichiles Indians inhabited an area of approximately 100,000 square kilometers, making them the most populous Chichimeca nation. Much of eastern Zacatecas, western San Luis Potosí, northeastern Jalisco, western Guanajuato, and southern Coahuila were inhabited by the Guachichiles. The Guachichiles Indians were categorized under the Uto-Aztecan linguistic family's Aztecoidan division. They were thought to be closely related to the Huichol Indians, who still reside in Nayarit and the western outskirts of Zacatecas today. The Mexica gave them the name Guachichile, which means red-headed, because they were distinguished by red feather headdresses, by painting themselves red, especially the hair, or by wearing head coverings, bonetillas, made of hides and painted red. They had been assigned this designation. The characteristics of the Guachichiles Indians were described by archaeologist Paul Kirchhoff as painting of the body, coloration of the hair, headgear, matrilocal residence, freedom of the married woman. The Guachichiles were thought to be the most developed of the Chichimec tribes in terms of the formation of tribal alliances. They played a significant role in inciting the other tribes to oppose Spanish colonization and exploitation of Indian territories. Professor Powell wrote that they were particularly successful at raiding and evading Spanish retaliation because of their strategic location in relation to Spanish mines and highways. Punitive Spanish expeditions found it difficult to locate and then attack bands of Guachichile warriors because the Guachichiles' territory was so large and mountainous, and it was situated east of the first silver strikes. The relatively late Spanish advance into the heart of the Guachichile territory gave these natives several decades in which to develop systematic, effective fighting techniques and a string of victories that encouraged them to greater resistance, as Professor Powell points out. The Guachichiles were described by Spanish frontiersmen and modern authors as the most fierce, the most courageous, and the most elusive of all their native enemies. Furthermore, their language's many sharply variant dialects made it challenging for the Christian missionaries to learn. The Guamares Penjamo in San Miguel served as the hub of the Guamares Nation, which was situated in the Guanajuato Sierras. They stretched nearly to Querétaro in the east and as far north as San Felipe. They also reached Lagos de Moreno and Aguascalientes in the west. The Guamares are the bravest, most warlike, treacherous, and destructive of all the Chichimecas, and the most astute, dispuesta, according to author Gonzalo de las Casas. The area between Aguascalientes and Jalostotitlán was home to a group of Guamar people known as the Chichimecas Blancos. The Guamares in this branch painted their heads white. But like the Guachichiles, many Guamares painted their bodies different colors, especially red, and dyed their long hair red. The Caxcanes. You probably have a large number of Caxcanes Indian ancestors if they came from western Aguascalientes, southwestern Zacatecas, or northern Jalisco. The Aztecoidan division of the Uto-Aztecan linguistic stock included the Caxcanes Indians as one of its tribes. According to a theory put forth by Dr. Phil C. Weigand of the Colegio de Michoacan's Department of Anthropology in Mexico, the Chalchihuites region of northwest Zacatecas is most likely where the Caxcan Indians first settled. According to Dr. Weigand, the Caxcanes began a prolonged period of southern expansion into parts of Jalisco following the fall of the Chalchihuites culture, which occurred between 900 and 1000 AD. Additionally, according to Dr. Weigand, the Caxcanes were probably organized into small conquest states at the time of the Spanish contact. A steady expansion carried by warfare to the south seems to have been the overriding theme of their history, he adds. Additionally, the Caxcans seem to have been organized into highly competitive expansion states, according to Dr. Weigand. These nations had strong military brotherhoods, colossal architecture, and sophisticated social structures. Teocaltiche in Jalisco and Juchipila, Tehuel, Tlatenango, Nochislan, and Jalpa in Zacatecas were among the Caxcanes, religious centers and piñoles, fortifications. As the Spanish's enemies at first, and then as their allies against the Zacatecos and Guachichiles, the Caxcanes were involved in both the Mixton Rebellion, 1540-41, and the Chichimeca War, 1550-1590. The number of Caxcanes was significantly decreased by the 1584 cocolistal epidemic. The remaining Caxcanes blended in with the more prevailing cultures that had colonized their area in the ensuing decades. The Caxcanes no longer exist as an ethnic group today, according to Dr. Weigand, and their last survivors were identified in the late 1890s. The Pames, the Guachichiles and Zacatecos, who spoke Uto-Aztecan languages, were not closely related to the Seminomadic Pames because they belonged to a very different branch of the Otomangayan linguistic family. which is currently one of the largest in Mexico. The Pames were primarily found in Querétaro, southern Tamaulipas, eastern Guanajuato, and the southeast region of San Luis Potosi. The Otomíes of Guanajuato, the Purépecha of Michoacán, and the Guamares in the west all shared territory with the Pames, who lived south and east of the Guachichiles. The Pames were primarily raiders of livestock at first, but they joined the Chichimeca War in the middle of the 1570s and began attacking and murdering settlers. The Pames refer to themselves as indigenous or Shi'ui. Anyone who is not of mestizo ancestry is referred to by this term. Only when they are speaking Spanish do they refer to themselves as Pame. However, they try to avoid using this word because it has a disdainful connotation in their religion. Because the Pames lived in scattered communities in the Grand Chichimecas mountains and deserts, they were difficult for the Spaniards to subdue, which allowed them to survive to this day. The Pames possessed the ability to live on the periphery of more densely populated Mesoamerica, according to Andrew L. Toth. According to the 2010 census, 98.2% of the 11,627 Pame-speaking individuals in Mexico resided in San Luis Potosi. The Sierra Ñañu, or Otomi Indians. When the Spanish arrived in Mexico, the Otomis, who identify as Ñañu or Ñañu, occupied portions of Guanajuato, Querétaro, Hidalgo, and the state of Mexico. In the past, the Otomi were highly respected and powerful in east-central Mexico. However, the Otomis declined in the 14th century as a result of the Aztec Empire's rise. The Otopamian language family, a subfamily of the vast Otomanguean linguistic group, includes Ñañu. The majority of the indigenous Oaxacan groups, such as the Mixtecs and Zapotecs, are members of this language family. The Otomis formed an alliance with the Spanish and Mexica Indians shortly after the Spanish arrived in Mexico. Otomi settlers were thus given a grant of privileges and provided with tools for breaking land, according to Professor Powell. They received a certain degree of autonomy in their towns and were released from tribute in exchange for their loyalty. The second viceroy of Nueva España, Luis de Velasco, employed Otomi militia to combat the Chichimecas in the 1550s. Because Otomi settlements were strategically located in Nueva Galicia, their language became the dominant one in the vicinity of Zapotitlan, Juchitlan, Otlan, and other towns close to Jalisco's southern border with Colima. The Otomi language is still widely spoken throughout much of central and eastern Mexico today, and it is a very diverse linguistic group with a strong cultural tradition. The Otomi language is the seventh most common language group in Mexico, with 288,052 speakers according to the 2010 census. The Chichimeca Indians were quickly absorbed into the more prevailing cultures, working in the mines and fields alongside the Aztec, Tlaxcalan, Otomi, and Tarascan Indians, who had also settled in Zacatecas. The Guachichiles and Zacatecos Indians vanished as distinct cultural groups, assimilated into the Spanish and Indian groups that had invaded their territories 50 years prior. According to Professor Powell, the land of war in the 16th century thus became fully Mexican in its mixture. All of the Chichimecas eventually submitted to Spanish authority. The Spanish administrators bribed and convinced the majority of the Chichimeca tribes to settle down instead of defeating them militarily. They were integrated into Mexico's developing mestizaje culture in a matter of decades. The majority of Chichimeca Indians have lost their languages, spiritual beliefs, and cultural practices. Their traditions have vanished into thin air. However, anyone whose ancestors came from Guanajuato, Zacatecas, Jalisco, and Aguascalientes still feels the blood of the Guachichiles, Zacatecos, Caxcanes, and Guamares in their hearts. Genetic extinction did not follow their cultural extinction.